Ralph Waldo Emerson played a big role in shaping Wright's intellectual identity. I do not want to necessarily call it an influence because that might suggest a certain symmetry between the two. Rather, the impact was more like salt in water. More once dissolves, it dissipates in ways that are hard to trace. Now, anytime Emerson is mentioned to explain Wright, the big question is why? Why pair the two? The story is long, but goes back to Wright's maternal family, staunch Unitarians who adhere to the sage like a moth to a flame. Not an evening went by, it seems, without a discussion about topics that also included Emerson. He was consulted about God just as much about education and friendship. It is tempting to see in Emerson's words the source of images that became Wright's architecture. Between Emerson's nature and Wright's falling water, for instance, there is indeed a high resemblance. Both stand in the woods and revel in dappled light, the sound of a stream running by, air uncontaminated by industrial fumes. The same with the lily pads at the Johnson Wax headquarter building in Racine, Wisconsin. They too can be said to have come from the same literary source. But that is really not the most fruitful pairing of the architect and writer, I would argue. What Wright took from Emerson's nature instead was the notion of correspondence, of course, among other things, and the need to create in man the ability to align exterior with interior expression. In Wright's hands, this would translate into a lifelong pursuit of blurring the line between exterior yard and interior space. What rigid and straight walls had separated the two had to go in favor of those that flickered and turned and made it almost impossible to distinguish between private room and open environment. Correspondence also meant the continuity of line, again between inside and outside, but also across space and room, from which Wright's fascination with the horizontal line evolved. Here in this picture, we see the floor and the balcony conspiring and indeed corresponding to achieve as much. Also along the window and around the corner, the line went on, further uniting otherwise disparate side, opposite worlds. The horizontal line would soon translate into a love of the horizon for the same reason as the horizontal line, but this time in relation to the need to cultivate in the eye the ability to internalize and hold within one view a diverse set of objects. The canyon of space between buildings back in the city suffocated sight and polarized man's relation with fellow man, making that person but a narrow and limited thinker of the world. Hey, why not open things up? Which Wright does across his work, but especially so in Broadacre City. His agrarian response to a nation overrun by urban capitalism, as we see here in the picture. The story of Broadacre is also long, but through it we see Wright imparting on us the lessons of the horizon, namely that if wide and long, it can diversify our views of the world without bias, our intellect becoming more complex precisely because we now know how to synthesize conflicting systems. In effect, the horizon naturally led to the question of the eye, and how exactly do we see things? For Emerson, the eye had been sadly truncated and limited in its capacity to take the world in, and this by a scientific revolution that had edited views more than it had admitted, perhaps best exemplified by Newton's camera obscura. Emerson called for a transparent eyeball as a corrective, an eye that sees everything and leaves nothing out, honoring the fact that our heads, and indeed our eyes as well, sit on a swivel, and a body that can turn and allow us to see backward as much as forward. How true, Wright believed. Similarly, lamenting a classical architecture stymied by strict distinctions between front and back, left and right, including formal facades that dictated where and how we should see things. It was, quite frankly, time to break the box and let the eye roam free, see the world in all its joys and mishaps. Let it not be the judge of matters it knows hardly anything about, that is the eye, and certainly not about things it knew very little about or had its full share of the world. It was from that premise that the corner window arose, even at the risk of structural integrity, liberating man once and for all. Born out of this line of inquiry is a return to the ancient dilemma of whether we see what we see because Light enters the eye or light leaves the eye? Intromission or extramission? Ancient pre-Socratic philosophers believed that the truth lied in a kind of fire that resided in our eye, projecting light out and enabling us to capture the world of objects outside, which may sound a little crazy and weird, a fire in the eye, but which for Emerson meant that we had agency and could affect what we see just as much as the other way around. We possessed the fire to turn things or nothing into something, raw materials into useful objects, nature into art. The matter fascinated Wright to no end. Sitting atop the auditorium building in Chicago and looking askance, he would gaze for hours into the open furnace mills, mesmerized by their glow and vigor. Reminiscent of something like Aladdin's lamp, about which Wright had read and loved doing so as a child. It is not for nothing that when Wright designed fireplaces, he did so with ritual and care. These were more than hearths around which to gather, but symbols of man's great potential, including the kettles he so often attached to them. In the case of falling water, he would recommend to the Kaufmans, for instance, that they use it to boil wine and drink the residue, which was an ancient Roman ritual or tradition by which to increase fertility and intellectual vigor. I think the Kaufmans did it once, but then abandoned the practice, no doubt because it was a little bit too laborious. Which leads me to this final picture, and one that speaks for itself, namely that no matter what we may think of Wright, what he wanted for us at the end of the day is to glow from the inside out with passion, energy, and determination. Don't wait for the world to come to you, he might have said. You go to it.